Welcome all PCU members. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about the Carlsbad theme. In chess, pawn structures are perhaps the most important, the most defining characters of the game. Based on how the pawns are positioned, we pick our plans and we know our priorities. And in this particular lesson, we'll look at a game between the famous German Grandmaster Ullmann, who was dominating in the 60s in East Germany, against the Dutch Grandmaster Donner. Okay, let's get started with this game. We started out as a Queen's Gambit. d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Although for now it looks like it may be a Queen's Indian or a Nimzo Indian, but after knight f3, black chose to transpose back to a regular Queen's Gambit by playing d5. White continues, knight c3 and bishop e7. Very solid. And here, white captured immediately on d5, which is not a very common thing to do nowadays. White would rather first develop the bishop, the dark squared bishop, to f4 or g5 and choose to capture on d5 or not at a later stage. Now black has the option to capture back with the knight or the pawn. Both are playable. And white now played bishop to g5, developing the bishop. Okay, so after this trade of pawns that we just saw the previous move, we already have achieved the so-called Carlsbad pawn structure. What do we need to know about it? Well, white has a chain of pawns of 5 pawns from the d file through the h file, and then only 2 pawns on the queen side, while black on the other hand has a pawn majority on the queen side and less pawns on the king side. However, black has access to an open e-file after castling obviously and putting a rook there. And therefore black often tries to create counterplay and develop initiative through that e-file. On the other hand, what's very typical for white, that white creates a so-called minority attack. What does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it sounds like. That white, even though having only 2 pawns versus black's pawn majority of 3 pawns, white most often tries to create an attack, a storm on the queen side, even though that's a rare thing in chess that we try to attack when we are weaker. This is an exception to that rule, and you shall see what I mean in just a few moves. As so common for this pawn structure, black played c6 to make sure to put his pawn on the open file, the c file where white can go with his rooks, for example, or queen, to put the pawn onto a safe square, that is, to a square where another black pawn is protecting the c6 pawn. Pawns that can be protected by another pawn are usually not considered weak pawns. On the other hand, when a pawn is on an open file and can only be protected by pieces, they can easily become targets of attack. White continued by playing queen c2. The main purpose of this move is to prevent the black bishop to occupying its most active position on f5. Also, in some games, white chooses to castle to the queen side. Whenever you would do that, especially if you're already missing a c-pawn and your opponent castling on the opposite side, that always involves taking some risk. Whenever the 2 kings are castled on opposite sides, that leads to a sharp game with risks for both players. And black chose a good move right now by playing g6, even though it's an exception from the rules, because generally whenever you already developed your bishop of the dark squares in this case, you do not want to play a move like g6 that weakens dark squares in front of your future castling position. However, in this case, black found it important enough to yet develop that bishop to f5 before the white bishop would arrive to d3 and permanently prevent that. So don't forget, this is an exception from the rule that has been tested in numerous games successfully for black. Black gains more or achieves more by being able to position his bishop to f5 than the weakening of the dark squares on the king side. And the reason being that other than the white bishop, the white other pieces have difficulty in getting there, aiding the bishop. White continued with development and played e3, and black is the first one to occupy this important diagonal. Also, the exchange of the light squared bishops certainly favors black because, again, if we look at the pawn structure, we shall see that the white pawns on d4, and it is especially important to look at pawns that are already in a blocked-in position, like the two pawns d4 and d5. They are not likely to move anywhere anytime soon. And also, the white pawns d4, e3, and f2, they are all in dark squares. And therefore, they are potential target for black's bishop. On the other hand, if you look at the black pawns on c6 and d5, the ones that are not likely to go anywhere, they are on light squares and on opposite colors from white's bishop, and therefore they are harder to target. In the meantime, black castled. It's always important to put our king to safety. And at this moment, the game became really interesting and instructive. White, of course, could castle, and it certainly wouldn't be a bad choice. But white immediately chose to go for the minority attack, even by trading the bishop for the knight, to follow it up by playing b4. Now white's plan is to play b5 as soon as possible, which will result in the exchange of white's b pawn for black's c pawn. And in either way that manifests itself, for example, by black capturing the pawn on b5, it will leave the d5 pawn isolated. Or if black will allow the trade on c6 to happen, then already black will have either a isolated d5 pawn again, or if captures back with the pawn, black's pawn on c6 will be a backward pawn. Why? Because it will be on an open file, and also there is no other black pawn that can possibly protect that pawn. So after b4, now black has several choices. One is to ignore and allow white just playing b5. Another one is to do what black did in the game and play a6, trying to prevent it for now. And the third one would be to play b5, to put your own pawn there. The problem with this is that on one hand, now again the c6 pawn will become a target and the backward pawn. And also in this very position, white would be able to play a4 immediately, without black having the option to maintain this pawn structure and play a6, because then after the trade on b5, the black pawn on a6 is pinned, therefore only the c pawn could capture back, and now again black has two targets on d5 and a6 that white could go for. After the exchange of pawns on b5, white will still win a pawn right away by moving the knight to b5, again using that same pin. Okay, let's go back just a tiny bit and look at the position. After b4, black continued with a6, trying to prevent the b5 advance, but as we shall see, black achieves to do that only temporarily. For now, white is ready to castle. It's important to put the king to safety. And then the idea is to prepare playing a4 and then b5 anyway. Black responded by bishop e7, attacking white's pawn, and white reacted with rook a b1, protecting that same pawn, and black played knight d7. One of black's idea here can be is to put the knight onto the outpost on c4. White played rook f to d1, and black responded with bishop d6, improving the position of the bishop and also for now preventing the white knight's centralization to e5. And finally, the moment came when white was ready to play a4. Now the plan is to play b5, and here black had to be careful what to do. Perhaps the best option was to play knight b6 and indeed try to get to c4. The reason why I do not like b5 here, because white would play a5, preventing the black knight from coming to b6 and then c4. In the meantime, white will move the knight away from c3 and possibly double up against the weak c6 pawn. So after a4, black continued with knight f6, and I think that's a move to the wrong direction. After all, the action is on the queen side, and black is very far from creating any kind of attack on the king side, especially in view of white's knight on f3 that beautifully guards everything around the white king. And now it was action time. b5. Now is the time when black has to choose between the unpleasant choices, either by isolating the d5 pawn, by moving the c pawn up and allowing a trade on c5, which actually results in losing a pawn right away after a discovery on the c file, capturing with the c pawn on b5, and then again having a weak pawn on d5 that white could eventually attack again with the queen, for example, relocating to b3, or what black did in the actual game by trading on b5 with the a pawn. White, of course, captures back, and now again black has the option to trade on b5, push the pawn, or just leave the c6 pawn where it is, and that's exactly what black did. Black moved the rook to a3, creating a pin over the white knight on c3, but allowing that very trade on c6. White didn't feel there was a rush, although I personally probably would trade right away on c6. White just moved the queen out of the pin, making sure there are no unpleasant surprises there, and after all, there's nothing much black can do. Black played queen a8, and voila, here we go. Pawn captures on c6, creating the backward pawn in the c6 pawn. Now white made a smart move, making sure no more back rank problems will ever arise, and played g3. This is one of those situations when you rather play g3 than h3, because h3, even though it would put the pawn on an opposite color square than black's bishop, but at the same time it would not take care of the back rank problem that white is trying to solve. Why would white worry about that now when there is no mating threat? Well, the reason is white wants to make sure that his rooks and queen are both liberated from the duty of guarding the back rank, avoiding getting checkmated on the first rank. So that's the idea behind playing g3. And the important thing is that even though white has put another pawn on the dark square, this pawn is not blocked and will have the potential to move forward later in the game, as there is no black pawn in front of it. Black moved the rook to c8, getting ready to protect the pawn yet another time. And white played knight e5, putting more pressure on that same pawn. If right now black would trade on e5, that would not be a good idea, because after the black knight moves away, White would be ready to capture and win a pawn on d5, at the same time threatening with multiple forks, knight e7 check, or even just knight b6. So that would not be a great idea. Going back to the game, black did not trade on e5, but chose a very risky move and pushed up the c pawn to c5. Well, if black can get away with it without losing anything, of course it'd be a good idea to trade that weak c pawn for white stable d4 pawn. But white is not about to do that. On the other hand, black allowed a fork with knight b5 right away, which attacks black's bishop on d6 and rook on a3. If right now black would want to get away with a trade on e5, white could simply capture the black rook. The game continued with rook a2. And this is a very interesting moment of the game. The white queen is under attack, and white has to make a serious decision, either to go for the combination or move the queen away. If white would move the queen away now, then the black bishop would get the time to move away also, and black would be just fine. Or, if the queen would try to maintain the pin with queen c3, even more unpleasant would be the black knight appearing on e4 with a tempo, not only attacking the white queen, but also the f2 pawn. Okay, so let's go back to the game position where white was at the critical moment on moving the queen to a random square or playing rook b2, blocking the attack, or going for the kill. And white, I presume, has planned for it before he played knight b5 and sacrificed the queen. A beautiful move where white gets actually a rook, a bishop, and a pawn for the queen. So materially speaking, 5 plus 3 plus 1 still equals 9. So white has enough compensation, but just purely by the material balance, white is not having an advantage. On the other hand, because that pawn is not just a pawn, but it will be a very dangerous passed pawn on the c-file, it will give white the advantage. And the black rook is under attack, and it moves to c7, trying to hold off the white pawn that's about to get to c5. Let's see some opportunities what could have happened if black instead moves the rook to f8, trying to hang on to the f7 pawn, which may have been a better choice. Then white would capture on c5, and now the road of the c pawn seems all paved out. Although things are not quite that simple, black could play queen a3, for now preventing the advancement of the c pawn because it's indirectly pinned, and the knight on d6 would be falling. Now white could try to play ambitiously, immediately going for the exchange on f7, and then to push the c pawn forward. Things look very, very dangerous for black. Black needs to look for counterplay. Play knight e4, c7. The pawn pretty much cannot be stopped, or it only can be stopped by the cost of the knight. But black can look for counterplay by playing queen a2. Now, if white just promotes the pawn to a queen, black will have the opportunity not only to grab the pawn on f2, but then immediately to give perpetual checks with the queen. So that doesn't accomplish white's goal. Let's go back and see what else white can do instead of promoting the pawn immediately. Well, the only other option is to play now rook f1 and protect the f2 pawn, but then the cost is that the c pawn does not have a backing of the rook. So now the black queen can go to c4. And if rook c1, the knight can block on c3. So this certainly would have been a better option from white's perspective. Let's go back again. and see what happened in the game when black chose the inferior rook c7. Of course, even after rook f8, white could have played more cautiously, but perhaps may not have won the game. Rook c7, and now d takes c5. At this stage, white's goal will be to chase that rook out from the squares in front of the white pawn. For example, if right now black would play king g7, white would advance the pawn and then chase the rook out with knight b5 and advance the pawn and again chase the rook out from c8. Even perhaps more accurate, attacking the queen first and then c7 followed by either knight a7 or knight d6. Let's go back again. And here we are. After dc5, black played rook c5, which makes white's life even easier. Of course, now not rook takes rook, because then queen would take on b1 with a check, but first making an intermediate move, check, followed by rook takes rook. White can then get the knight back, but nevertheless now white has two rooks against the queen, which is a small material advantage. But here, white is able to increase that advantage real soon because of the weakness of the f7 pawn. White protected the knight, and came queen e7, attacking the rook. Now white has to be careful not to move the rook away and lose the knight. White connected his two rooks. And here is where black made yet another mistake by playing h5. A better option was to try to play knight e4 at this moment, in hopes for perpetual checks. Black played h5, and white responded with knight e8. This forces the exchange of knights. Came queen b7 and rook cd8. Even though black can push d4 now with a discovered check, it wouldn't really achieve anything because white would play e4 and then double up the rooks on the d file against black's d pawn and win that pawn. Black instead made a suicidal mistake by playing f5. This unnecessarily opens up to danger the black king. Check, king h7, rook b8, chasing the queen off the diagonal, so white doesn't need to worry about discovered checks with the d pawn advancing. And now white is ready for checkmate. Check, king h6, check, king g5, check, and if king g4, the pawn checkmates, or if king f6, the rook checkmates. Therefore, black resigned. A very interesting game that demonstrates the basic idea of the minority attack in the Carlsbad team pawn structure. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this beautiful composition by Procas, white amazingly can win the game. At first it seems easy, white can just promote the pawn. However, we can quickly recognize that that would be not a good idea, because it would allow the skewer immediately with the back rook. I suggest you take a moment and try to figure out the solution on your own before you listen to the correct answer. And I bet you got it. That correct answer is the unexpected, beautiful move, bishop c5. Hey, but this bishop is hanging there. What's that about? Well, simple. If the rook captures, then obviously the pawn is ready to get promoted as there is no more skewer. Yeah, I understand, but what about if the pawn captures? Now you gave up the bishop, and still if the pawn promotes, the skewer is there. Well, that's true, but now the white king is ready to come to e7. Not to e8, because if the king would go to e8, the rook would just go to h5 and black would win easily. So, as we said, the king moves to e7. And now that the black rook no longer can go to a5 behind white's a pawn. All black can do is give some checks. Check, king d7, check, king c7, and all of a sudden black ran out of checks and cannot prevent the white pawn from getting promoted, which leads to a winning advantage. A beautiful endgame, great idea. Remember it, you never know, it may come up in one of your games one day. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.